You know the story well. 6 days of creation, one of rest, and everything was complete. But what if I told you that this might not be the end of the story? There are ancient, little-known records that speak of an 8th day, a forgotten time, perhaps purposefully silenced. Why are these texts not in the common Bible? What do they reveal that so many religious authorities have chosen to ignore? You are about to enter into one of the most hidden mysteries of biblical tradition, an enigma preserved in fragments, forgotten liturgies, and alternative calendars. Stay until the end. What you are about to hear could forever change the way you understand creation. What if this truth is hidden right before your eyes? Before we dive into this profound mystery, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any revelations like this. And comment below, have you heard about the 8th day of creation before? Or is this all new to you? Your opinion is very important, and it can awaken others too. The number 7 carries a sacred weight in the Bible. It is the number of completion, of order, of a closed cycle. But what about 8? In several ancient Jewish and Christian traditions, the 8th day appears as a symbol of transcendence, something that goes beyond the natural world. Instead of closure, it represents a new beginning, a new time. The curious thing is that despite its symbolic importance in several ancient rites, we rarely hear about it, from the pulpits, seminaries, or Sunday schools. Why? What is there about this 8th day that many have preferred to hide? Some scholars point to the Book of Jubilees, an apocryphal work highly respected by certain Jewish groups in antiquity. There, creation is described in more layers and cycles than in traditional Genesis. The 8th day is mentioned symbolically, not as a continuation of the previous days, but as the beginning of a new kind of time. There are also traces of this idea in ancient rabbinic commentaries and even in Christian liturgical hymns from the 2nd century. Is the 8th day a time reserved only for the initiated, a spiritual dimension that few are prepared to understand? The truth is that over the centuries, the 8th day has been treated as a secret, not necessarily forbidden, but veiled, present in symbols, rites, and structures, but rarely explained. Circumcision on the 8th day, the 8th day of Jewish feasts, baptism on Sunday, all seem to point to a time beyond the natural. And this raises the big question, did God really complete his creation on the 7th day? Or did he simply end the visible phase and leave something hidden, waiting for the right moment to be revealed? When we return to the original Hebrew of Genesis, we come across something curious. The text says that God finished his work on the 7th day, but the word used, Shabbat, does not simply mean rest. It can also imply an interruption, an intentional pause. This has generated centuries of debate among rabbis. Was creation truly completed, or did God simply interrupt a process that is still ongoing? This linguistic ambiguity leaves room for the idea that something continued, something that perhaps did not fit into the 7 days, and that could only be understood by those who accessed the 8th. This theory is echoed in several apocryphal sources. In the Gnostic texts found at Nag Hammadi, for example, there are mentions of a hidden time reserved for the full revelation of divine light, a cycle beyond material creation where the limitations of the body and matter are overcome. For the Gnostics, the 8th day was not an extension of ordinary time. It was a new reality. And interestingly, even though they were considered heretical by many, their ideas about this 8th cycle influenced discussions among early Christians, especially in the way they understood resurrection, eternity, and transformation. The early Christians were also not unaware of the symbolic power of the 8th day. For many of them, Sunday, the day of Christ's resurrection, was more than the first day of the week. It was the day after the 7th, the beginning of a new creation. Fathers such as Justin Martyr and Irenaeus wrote of the eighth day as a symbol of eternity, of the new humanity, of the kingdom to come. But as the centuries passed, this symbolism was diluted, replaced by more institutionalized rituals. What had once been seen as a gateway to mystery came to be treated as a simple weekly repetition. In Judaism, something similar occurred. Festivals such as Shemini Atzeret, the eighth day of assembly, had profound meanings, marking a time of intimacy with God after the 7 days of Sukkot. It was a silent, reserved moment, without specific commandments, as if it were a suspended time. Many rabbis saw this eighth day as a time of exclusivity between God and the people, a cycle that does not repeat itself since it belongs to the dimension of eternity. But the symbolism was gradually relegated to the margins, maintained only by scholars and mystics. Another striking detail is how certain biblical rituals seem to echo the eighth day pattern. The consecration of priests, for example, lasted 7 days, but only on the 8th were they ready to minister. In Leviticus 9, Aaron and his sons did not begin their priestly service until the 8th day, after a full period of preparation. What does this indicate? That the 8th day is not just a continuation, but a milestone, the beginning of something qualitatively new, no longer formation but action, no longer preparation but manifestation. What was God signaling with this pattern? Circumcision, one of the oldest commandments, is also performed on the 8th day of life. The rabbis explained that this represents a time beyond nature. The body goes through a complete cycle of 7 days, and on the 8th day it is consecrated. The number 8 in this context symbolizes that which transcends the natural. But few stop to think, why would God have chosen the 8th day as a sign of the covenant? Wouldn't it be more logical to perform this act on a perfect day like the 7th? The choice of 8 seems to hide a spiritual code, something that defies traditional cycles and points to another dimension. This pattern is repeated in several biblical structures. When Solomon completed the temple, the people celebrated for 7 days, and on the 8th day there was a solemn assembly, as recorded in 2 Chronicles 7. This 8th day had no prescribed rituals, but it was considered the climax of the celebration. Talmudic scholars saw this day as an expression of direct divine favor, without intermediaries, without instructions, without law. What does this reveal? That the 8th day would be the space where God's presence manifests itself not out of obligation, but out of intimacy. But if the 8th day carries such lofty spiritual symbolism, why has it been left out of common teaching? Why is it rarely the subject of sermons or studies? One possible answer is its disruptive potential. By suggesting that there is something beyond the known creation, beyond time, beyond the established order, the 8th day threatens solid theological structures. It calls into question whether what we call the end is really the end, or merely the beginning of a greater reality, reserved for those who dare to look beyond the boundaries of tradition. Within the Jewish mystical tradition, especially in Kabbalah, the 8th day appears in a veiled form as a symbol of the highest stage of the human soul, one that can only be accessed after the complete purification of the senses. For Kabbalists, the 7 days represent the 7 lower sephirot, or visible aspects of the spiritual world. The 8th is linked to what is hidden, to the dimension that cannot be touched by rules, dogmas, or human laws. It is the domain of mystery. It is no wonder that this concept was transmitted only among initiates, far from the reach of those who were not prepared to understand. This separation was not due to elitism, but to protection. The 8th day, in the mystical mindset, represented a spiritual power so intense that it could cause imbalance if revealed prematurely. For this reason, Many of the ancient masters preferred to leave only clues, hidden numbers in texts, symbolic mentions at festivals, structures with 8 columns or 8 steps in ancient temples. All of these were clues, fragments of a map for those who dared to look deeper. But are there still people today who keep this knowledge alive? In some Eastern Christian traditions, this wisdom has never been completely erased. Certain Byzantine liturgies still refer to the 8th eternal day, especially in the celebrations of Easter, which is seen not only as the victory over death, but as the entry into the time of the new creation. In Orthodox theology, the 8th day is spoken of as the beginning of the kingdom of God, not as a distant hope, but as a reality already possible to be touched by those who live in holiness. A time within time, a space where heaven and earth meet. Why, then, has this notion been practically erased in the West? The answer may lie in the fear of losing control. Organized religions, however well-intentioned, need order, doctrine, predictability. The 8th day, with its transcendent nature, defies all of this. It cannot be measured, regulated, or confined. It represents a break with the closed cycle of creation, a direct invitation to the human spirit to go beyond its own limits and rediscover its divine origin. That is perhaps why it was easier to silence it, to let it survive only in symbols, in hidden rituals, in the forgotten corners of history. If we go back to Genesis with this new lens, we realize that the text never clearly says that everything ended. It states that God rested, but not that creation was definitively finished. Tradition assumed that the cycle was complete with the 7th day, but the texts do not close this door, and it is precisely in this gap that the 8th day appears. It is not an addition, but an unfolding, a phase of creation that is not counted in ordinary days because it belongs to another type of time, an eternal time, a time revealed only to those who go beyond the limits of the flesh, the calendar, and reason. This view also appears in early non-canonical Christian texts. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, often associated with Gnostic traditions, speaks of a place of light accessible to those who are part of the 8th. Although symbolic, the use of this number is not random. The ancient authors were convinced that there is something beyond the counted time, a stage that is not revealed but spiritually accessible. The 8th day, in this context, is not a future moment but a state of consciousness, a mode of existence that is already present but only visible to the spiritual eye. This is why so many ancient mystics spoke of the 8th day as the abode of the righteous or the throne of glory. In some currents of mystical Judaism, it is described as the stage where human beings return to their pre-fallen condition, not in the physical Eden, but in the higher Eden, where man and God were in full communion. The 8th day is the rebuilding of this bridge. It is the time when there is no longer any separation between the divine and the human. But to access this stage, one must go beyond the 7 steps of creation and immerse oneself in the invisible. In the New Testament, we find echoes of this idea. In Hebrews chapter 4, it speaks of a rest that still remains for God's people, a rest not tied to the earthly Sabbath, but to an eternal spiritual rest. Many scholars see here an indirect reference to the 8th day, a rest that does not end creation, but elevates it, a state that is not limited to the body but involves the whole soul. The 8th day, then, would not be just a theory or a number. It would be a call, a reminder that history is not yet over. If we go back to Genesis with this new lens, we realize that the text never clearly says that everything ended. It states that God rested, but not that creation was definitively finished. Tradition assumed that the cycle was complete with the 7th day, but the texts do not close this door, and it is precisely in this gap that the 8th day appears. It is not an addition, but an unfolding, a phase of creation that is not counted in ordinary days because it belongs to another type of time, an eternal time, a time revealed only to those who go beyond the limits of the flesh, the calendar, and reason. This view also appears in early non-canonical Christian texts. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, often associated with Gnostic traditions, speaks of a place of light accessible to those who are part of the eighth. Although symbolic, the use of this number is not random. The ancient authors were convinced that there is something beyond the counted time, a stage that is not revealed but spiritually accessible. The eighth day, in this context, is not a future moment, but a state of consciousness, a mode of existence that is already present, but only visible to the spiritual eye. This is why so many ancient mystics spoke of the eighth day as the abode of the righteous, or the throne of glory. In some currents of mystical Judaism, it is described as the stage where human beings return to their pre-fallen condition, not in the physical Eden, but in the higher Eden, where man and God were in full communion. The eighth day is the rebuilding of this bridge. It is the time when there is no longer any separation between the divine and the human. But to access this stage, one must go beyond the 7 steps of creation and immerse oneself in the invisible. In the New Testament, we find echoes of this idea. In Hebrews chapter 4, it speaks of a rest that still remains for God's people, a rest not tied to the earthly Sabbath, but to an eternal spiritual rest. Many scholars see here an indirect reference to the eighth day, a rest that does not end creation, but elevates it, a state that is not limited to the body, but involves the whole soul. The eighth day, then, would not be just a theory or a number, it would be a call, a reminder that history is not yet over. From this point on, we understand that the eighth day is not just a lost interval in biblical chronology. It is, in fact, the transition point between the visible and the invisible, the material and the eternal. That is why ancient sages and mystics insisted so much on the need for purification, silence, and contemplation to understand this mystery. It is not a matter of adding a new dogma, but of opening our eyes to something that has always been there, hidden. And this key to reading completely changes our view of creation, redemption, and even eternity. Some traditions still preserve traces of this knowledge. In Ethiopian Christianity, for example, there are apocryphal texts that describe hidden days revealed to Enoch during his heavenly ascension. In these visions, the eighth day is described as the day of full light, when there is no longer any separation between the throne of God and creation. It is curious that these traditions, isolated for centuries, maintained this parallel vision while the West institutionalized its reading of Genesis. Perhaps it is a sign that truth always finds shelter even when it is rejected by the centers of power. And then an even deeper question arises. If the eighth day represents this higher dimension of reality, is it also present in our daily lives? But we are the ones who cannot see it. Are we already living parts of this eternal time, but without being aware of it? Mystics would say yes, that the eighth day can be accessed now, when we break with the ego, with repetition, with the closed cycle of nature, and enter a spiritual time where God reveals himself directly, a time of continuous revelation, where we neither work nor rest, we only contemplate. This is why, even without naming it, so many saints and prophets seem to live outside of time. Moses in his intimacy with God, John in his visions of the apocalypse, Paul when he spoke of being caught up to the third heaven. All these moments reflect something that escapes the earthly calendar, something that can perhaps only be understood if we accept that there is a time hidden behind the 7 known days, a time that the ancients called the eighth day, and that perhaps is precisely the time that matters most. Even in the field of biblical archaeology, evidence has emerged that arouses curiosity. Excavations in regions associated with ancient Israelite worship have revealed temples with structures in a pattern of 8 steps, columns, divisions. Although traditional scholars prefer to associate this with architectural styles or external influences, other researchers question, why does this number appear so frequently, especially in places with a spiritual function? Could the ancient priests have known about a symbolism that has now been lost? Were they symbolically constructing portals to a higher reality that could only be accessed in the 8th cycle? There are also linguistic clues that reinforce this possibility. In Hebrew, the number 8, Shemoneh, shares a root with the word shaman, which means oil, a biblical symbol of anointing, consecration and separation from the ordinary to the sacred. It is as if the number 8 were linked from its roots to something that transcends, something reserved, something that can only be touched when one leaves behind repetitive cycles and enters a state of plenitude. It is no coincidence that the festival of Hanukkah, celebrated for 8 days, celebrates the light that overcomes the limits of time and scarcity. This pattern also helps explain why so many rituals ended on the 7th day but only reached their climax on the 8th. It is as if God had planted small reminders throughout history that there was something more. The 8th day is not simply what comes after, it is what is above. It is God's time, not subject to human limitations. And perhaps for this reason, it is also the most feared, because those who enter this time do not return the same. Those who understand the 8th day understand that creation is not finished. It continues within us. At this point, the inevitable question is, why doesn't anyone talk about this? Why is this theme, which permeates the Bible, Jewish mysticism, Christian apocrypha, and even the physical structures of ancient faith, so little taught? The answer is straightforward, because it breaks the narrative. Because it invites us to seek ourselves, to abandon repetitions, to transcend forms. The 8th day is the greatest spiritual calling that can exist, but it is also the most dangerous for those who wish to maintain control over the faith of others. That is why it survives only in fragments, in shadows, in symbols. What is most intriguing is the realization that the 8th day has not been completely erased. It has been hidden from plain sight. It is present in practices that many perform without knowing their meaning. Every baptism, every 8th candle lit, every celebration after 7 cycles is, in fact, a coded reminder of this superior time, a trace that creation continues. And that changes everything. Because if the 8th day is still ongoing, if it is accessible, then the world is not locked into an ancient script, but open to God's ongoing revelation. This idea directly confronts a stagnant view of spirituality. The 8th day tells us that the Creator's work is still moving, growing, expanding, that He is still speaking, but few have ears to hear. No wonder Jesus said, "He who has ears, let him hear." Because entering the 8th day is not about intellectual understanding. It is about awakening, seeing what is behind the veil of routine. The 8th day is for those who leave the crowd and climb the mountain, for those who leave the physical temple and enter the eternal temple. And when we understand this, we realize that the 8th day is not a day on the calendar. It is a dimension, a frequency, a reality where God's presence is total, without mediation. It is the day when man returns to walk with God, not in the lost Eden, but in the restored Eden. A time without shadows, without cycles, without night, only light. That is why the ancients called the 8th day the time of full light. The the light that the world does not yet know, but that already shines in the hearts of those who seek it. Thus, the eighth day ceases to be a distant mystery and becomes an urgent invitation. It calls us to live as those who have already entered the kingdom, to look at creation not as something finished, but as a work in transformation. It challenges us to abandon the illusion of an end and embrace the eternal movement of the Spirit. For perhaps the greatest mistake of modern man is not to ignore the past, but to think that God's creation is already finished. The eighth day is thus the veiled promise that runs through the whole of Scripture, not as an explicit verse, but as a hidden melody playing behind the narrative. It appears when Enoch is taken up without seeing death, when Moses shines forth as he comes down from the mountain, when Christ is resurrected by breaking the seal of the Sabbath, when John looks upon the New Jerusalem and sees that there shall be no more night. All these moments are glimpses of the eighth day, the time when God is no longer hidden and man is no longer fallen. While the world insists on repeating the 7 days, cycle after cycle, routine after routine, the eighth day remains an open portal for those who refuse to live on autopilot, for those who seek, for those who question, for those who feel that there is still something to be revealed. It is more than a theological idea. It is a spiritual experience, a reality that begins now within those who have eyes to see. And perhaps in the end, that is what the eighth day is. The time when creation is completed not outside, but inside us, when we stop just existing and finally begin to live. And if this truth burns in your heart, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. And now we have a members area. By becoming a member, you bless this work and help us to continue producing edifying and revealing content like this. Just click on the Become a Member button below, next to the Subscribe button. Be a part of this.